Welcome to this explainer on the architecture of mass hysteria. We're going to dive right in and simulate a truly terrifying scenario, one that starts right in your very own neighborhood.
So imagine waking up one crisp morning, right? You step outside and you notice something feels off. Whispers. You find your own neighbors, people you've known for years, suddenly whispering your name the second you turn your back. It starts small, just hushed tones behind closed doors and sideways glances in the town square.
But it doesn't stay quiet for long. Seriously, by sunset, those secretive little whispers have violently escalated into open accusations. They aren't just whispering anymore. They are pointing fingers, shouting in the streets, and publicly claiming that you, their neighbor, are serving the devil. The sheer speed of this escalation is just breathtaking.
And then comes the absolute nightmare scenario. By the end of the week, you aren't just an outcast, you're standing in a courtroom facing a life or death sentence. And you know the most terrifying part about this rapid progression? There is absolutely zero physical evidence against you. The court is actively accepting something called spectral evidence. Basically, this meant an accuser could just claim your spirit or your ghost appeared to them in a dream to torment them. Like, how do you even provide an alibi for your ghost? You literally can't. You have almost no chance to defend yourself against these invisible supernatural crimes.
Now, this honestly sounds exactly like the plot of a psychological horror movie, doesn't it? But it's cold, hard American history. This is the story of the Salem witch trials. It really stands out as one of the darkest, most profound mass panics ever recorded. It wasn't fiction. It was terrifyingly real. It's been more than 330 years since this horrific series of events tore a community apart. More than 3 centuries have passed, and it left a brutal toll. 20 people were executed, and wildly enough, even 2 dogs were put to death after being formally accused of witchcraft. It's a staggering piece of history. Yet historians, psychologists, and everyday people today are still fiercely debating what actually triggered this catastrophe. How did a community just completely fracture and turn on itself so quickly? Did truly grasp the architecture of this historical tragedy, our source material points to 4 main theories: actual witches, mass hysteria, political revenge, and religious fear. Let's just jump right in and break these down.
Okay, first up, we have to look at the first theory and ask the most literal question. Were there actual witches? I know it sounds impossible to our modern ears, but we have to totally immerse ourselves in that 17th century mindset. To the Puritans of New England, the supernatural wasn't some fairy tale, it was a daily lived reality. The devil was seen as a physical entity roaming the woods just outside their village, actively seeking recruits. And this theory actually gained some historical traction when we look at the real testimonies, especially the famous confession of Tituba, an enslaved woman in the community. When pressed by aggressive investigators, she didn't just confess, she spun this elaborate, terrifying tale of a tall man in black, red cats, and a literal book where she and others had signed their names over to the devil. Now, whether she did this out of pure self-preservation to avoid the gallows, or whether folks in the village were just genuinely practicing local folk magic that got wildly misinterpreted, her vivid confession acted as a match dropped straight into a powder keg. For a moment, the community felt they had tangible proof that dark forces were genuinely terrorizing them.
But if we step away from the supernatural, we hit our second theory: mass hysteria. Did a blinding, uncontrollable psychological and physiological panic simply spread like a virus through this isolated town? The source material provides some fascinating, albeit heavily debated, scientific evidence for this. One major hypothesis points to ergot poisoning. Ergot is a naturally occurring fungus that grows on rye grain, especially after a particularly cold and damp winter, which happens to be exactly the kind of weather Salem had just experienced. Consuming ergot-infected bread can cause severe muscle spasms, violent convulsions, delusions, and hallucinations. Fun fact, it's actually the exact same fungus from which LSD was later derived. So imagine a group of young girls suffering from genuine, terrifying physical symptoms that the local doctor couldn't logically explain. Then, add to this the extreme psychological trauma of recent, brutal frontier wars with Native American tribes, which caused a constant state of hypervigilance. The community was already pushed to the absolute edge of its sanity, making them highly susceptible to a collective mental breakdown where intense fear literally makes people see, feel, and believe things that simply aren't there.
Moving on, could it have been political revenge? This is where the architecture of the panic gets incredibly dark, calculated, and entirely earthly. Salem in 1692 was a deeply divided town. It was practically split down the middle by bitter factionalism. You had Salem Village, the poorer, more traditional farming community, constantly at odds with Salem Town, the wealthier, evolving mercantile hub. When we examine historical maths mapping out the accusers versus the accused, a pretty chilling pattern emerges. The accusations weren't completely random. Prominent wealthy families, like the Putnams, were heavily involved in driving the accusations, and their targets often just happened to be their personal rivals, like the Porter family or vulnerable widows sitting on prime real estate. If your neighbor was convicted of witchcraft, their property could be confiscated. It's a deeply unsettling thought that a simple boundary dispute over a property line or a generational family grudge could be completely disguised as a righteous fight against the devil. People may have been effectively weaponizing the legal system and the religious frenzy to legally eliminate their rivals and consolidate local power.
And finally, that brings us to the fourth major theory: religious fear. Did an extreme, deep-seated religious paranoia create the absolute perfect environment for this panic to thrive? You see, the Puritan religion was intensely strict and governed every single aspect of daily life. At the absolute core of their theology was the concept of predestination. Basically, the belief that God had already chosen who was going to heaven and who was doomed to hell, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing you could do in your lifetime to change it. This created a culture of chronic, crushing anxiety. Everyone was constantly searching themselves and their neighbors for any tiny sign of sin that might indicate they were one of the doomed. There was virtually no room for nonconformity. If you didn't go to church, if you argued with your spouse publicly, or if you simply stood out too much, you were seen as a threat to the community's spiritual survival. In a rigid society where the devil was considered as active and present as the person living next door, that intense, unyielding religious anxiety acted as the ultimate accelerant. It completely transformed a strict social hierarchy into a lethal surveillance state where accusing someone else became the easiest way to deflect suspicion and prove your own religious purity.
So, when analyzing Salem today, we really have to actively work to strip away over 3 centuries of exaggerated storytelling, folklore, and pop culture adaptations. We have to separate the facts from the myth to see the event for what it truly was. It wasn't about Halloween costumes or cartoon villains. It was a highly complex disaster fueled by very real, deeply ingrained human flaws and societal pressures.
Because by critically looking at those 4 distinct theories, we uncover the terrifying truth. The Salem witch trials stand as a permanent, chilling monument, proving exactly how quickly any seemingly tight-knit community can turn on its own. When a society is fueled by fear, suspicion, systemic inequality, and a total lack of tangible evidence, the psychological guardrails simply collapse. It's a stark reminder that the mechanics of mass panic and witch hunts, whether literal or metaphorical, are deeply embedded in human psychology, which makes this history intensely relevant even in our modern world today.
Which brings us to the end of this explainer, and I want to turn it over to you. Based on the rapid progression from whispers to the courtroom and the 4 distinct theories we've outlined today, what do you believe the terrifying truth really is? Which theory, or maybe what combination of theories, do you think was the true spark that ignited the Salem witch trials? It's a heavy question for sure, but it's an essential one for us to ask and understand if we want to ensure history never repeats itself.